Obama a war criminal? JFK a serial cheater? These American presidents are famous for their impressive legacies, but that's not all they're known for. There were a number of questionable things about Barack Obama's presidency. In his first year in office, he was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize, presumably in anticipation of him making moves to undo some of the more aggressive policies of his predecessor. However, Obama would go on to authorize nearly 600 drone strikes that killed almost 4,000 people during his time in office, way more than George W. Bush had approved.
Simply put, these strikes have saved lives.
One such strike hit a funeral in Pakistan, causing the deaths of 41 civilians. He also authorized drone strikes against medical personnel and other first responders to keep them from helping any survivors from a previous drone strike. Attacks against medical personnel are against the Geneva Conventions, arguably making Obama a war criminal. His overall record on human rights was generally poor as well, as he never closed the military prison at Guantanamo Bay despite promises to do so, and he did nothing to stop CIA torture programs. He expanded surveillance systems instituted by the previous administration, and his ill-advised response to atrocities in Syria caused many to feel that the hope for improved foreign relations would go unfulfilled. It's no secret that Kennedy had a way with the ladies, and he engaged in a wide range of affairs, including with a 19-year-old intern, a friend of his wife, secretaries, actresses, and expensive sex workers. Of course, his most famous paramour is alleged to have been Marilyn Monroe, but there's no evidence the two actually slept together. That said, Kennedy's wife Jackie was fully aware of his extracurricular activities, but knew it was just something she would have to deal with. To keep the public out of the loop, however, Kennedy used the Secret Service to keep reporters out of his personal business, sometimes even with physical violence. Having grown up in a house full of brothers, Kennedy also exhibited a number of other hypermasculine traits, including being extremely competitive and often controlling in his relationships with others. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of America's most respected presidents, primarily because of his leadership in shepherding the U.S. through the Great Depression and most of World War II. However, despite his lengthy list of accomplishments, Roosevelt had a somewhat troubled personal life. FDR had a long-standing affair with his wife's social secretary, Lucy Mercer, which began well before his presidency and lasted until his death in 1945. When Eleanor Roosevelt found out about the affair, it strained their marriage. They stayed together for political reasons, though Eleanor had at least one extramarital relationship with another woman. Probably one of the biggest controversies from FDR's presidency was the forced internment of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II, out of fear that they were collaborating with the Japanese army. Even FDR's wife urged him to rethink this cruel policy, but she couldn't change his mind. As the first president of the United States, George Washington has earned immense respect, not only for his personal qualities, but also for the precedents he established for the office. The nation's capital is named after him, and there's a giant obelisk to remind you of how cool he was. But despite all this, he wasn't exactly perfect. For one thing, George Washington enslaved people, as did many of the founding fathers. It might be easy to dismiss this by saying every rich white guy at the time was an enslaver, but Washington's successor John Adams wasn't, and openly reproached his contemporaries who were, calling enslavement evil. Although it is true that Washington was the only enslaving president to free his enslaved people in his will, his wife kept hers. And also, there's a decent chance Washington impregnated an enslaved woman. Furthermore, Washington's goals to establish the American nation on Native American land typically superseded any attempt at doing right by the Native American tribes who owned that land. If tribes refused his offers to purchase land, he would send troops to drive them off violently, to the extent that the Iroquois referred to him as the town destroyer. Theodore Roosevelt might have made a good action hero. He spent time as a cowboy, an outdoorsman, a hunter, and a leader of a cavalry outfit called the Rough Riders. And if that wasn't enough, he survived a bullet to the chest.
I do not care a rap for being shot. It is a trade risk.
He's also respected as a president because of his devotion to the pursuit of progressive ideals, such as economic and social justice for all Americans. But despite his progressive politics, Roosevelt had a dark side. Roosevelt's approach to foreign policy was based on a firmly held belief in a racial hierarchy, with white people at the top. Many of the interventionist and even imperialist actions taken under the Roosevelt administration were based on the idea that territories such as Guam and the Philippines would be better off under the governance of white Americans. Because Roosevelt believed in the superiority of the white race, he was also an ardent supporter of the now repugnant eugenics movement, promoting the idea of only allowing people with desirable characteristics to reproduce, while those deemed inferior would be sterilized. Eugenics was, tragically, a fairly popular idea at the time, but it certainly doesn't sound like the square deal that Roosevelt famously promised all Americans. As a scholar of considerable intelligence, Jefferson wrote doctrines and statutes that helped determine what American ideals of freedom would be. He is, of course, most known for writing the Declaration of Independence, in which he famously declared that all men are created equal. However, despite the revolutionary idealism of these words, Jefferson was an enslaver, and unlike Washington, Jefferson never made an effort to free those enslaved by him. Over the course of his lifetime, Jefferson enslaved over 600 people, with as many as 140 at any one time. Thomas Jefferson also had at least 6 children by an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, and in such a relationship, it is impossible for the less powerful person to truly consent. Furthermore, Jefferson is known to have lied and bribed people to try to keep this relationship a secret. Harry Truman inherited the presidency when Franklin Roosevelt died during his 4th term, and with it came the responsibility of guiding America through the end of World War II. At the time he left office, Truman was extremely unpopular, but after a while his star began to rise. He became known for his foreign policy, sense of personal responsibility, and everyman persona. He was also responsible for one of the first major steps toward racial equality by desegregating the military in 1948. This executive order came as a surprise to many civil rights leaders, because Truman was known to have a dim view of Black Americans in his personal life, using slurs and telling racist jokes. His distaste for the civil rights movement became even more clear in the decades after his presidency, notably claiming that civil rights protests such as sit-ins were operations by communists. He opposed interracial marriage and criticized Martin Luther King, who asked Truman to apologize for his defamatory remarks and apparently received no reply. On a more personal level, Truman was often petty and juvenile. He had a contentious relationship with General Douglas MacArthur and somewhat famously called the general dumb after firing him. He also threatened to beat up a music critic who gave his daughter singing a bad review. And while still contested, to date, he is the only world leader who carried out a nuclear strike on civilian targets, killing almost 250,000 Japanese civilians. Even before he was president, Dwight D. Eisenhower was known for his military career, in which he served as the Allied commander in World War II and planned the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. He's also lauded for his record on civil rights and actions to help desegregate American schools.
Compulsory school segregation laws are unconstitutional.
However, Eisenhower had a legendary temper, getting angry at even small things. He was known as the terrible-tempered Mr. Bang among his staff for his tendency to blow up at even the littlest thing. He was aware of this problem, though, and had been since childhood. He took steps to try to curb his temper, like writing down the names of people who upset him and putting them in a drawer. Despite such measures, he would scream at anyone who mentioned Joseph McCarthy, and ordered squirrels shot when they dug holes on his putting green. Nobody is debating that Abraham Lincoln left a legacy. However, despite the fact that he's known for ending slavery in the U.S., in recent years, Lincoln's actual views toward Black people and Native Americans have become an increasingly hot topic. It's known that in his personal life, Lincoln used racial slurs and told racist jokes, and he also attended notoriously racist minstrel shows. In his famous debates with Stephen Douglas, he said that white people are superior to other races, and Lincoln initially wanted freed enslaved people to be sent back to Africa to colonize Liberia, rather than integrate into American society. It's important to note that Lincoln's views on race evolved over time, and it was in fact his support of voting rights for some black men that pushed his assassin John Wilkes Booth over the edge. Lyndon B. Johnson became president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated, but he had a long political career beforehand and managed to accomplish quite a bit during his time in the White House. That said, Johnson was famously a brash and crude individual. Johnson was quite proud of his own Johnson, which he not only nicknamed Jumbo, but also flopped out freely whether others wanted to see it or not. He was also known to use graphic language in public and political situations in a way that's not common for presidents. While foul language might not be a big deal for some, Johnson was also said to be cruel and vicious in his pursuit of grandeur for himself. He considered fellow Democrats who opposed his policies on Vietnam to be traitors and possibly under communist influence. Johnson was also a great lover of women and carried out an affair with a woman named Alice Glass for decades. Johnson's wife Lady Bird knew about Glass and Johnson's other affairs, but Johnson callously disregarded how his wife might feel about them, instead bragging that he'd slept with even more women than JFK.